Sometimes detention isn't about punishment, it's about discovering a connection you never saw coming. The first time I stepped into detention, I felt like the last person in the world who should be there. My backpack felt heavier than usual, as if it carried not only books but the weight of embarrassment. The classroom smelled faintly of old paper and the faint bitterness of leftover coffee, a combination that somehow made everything feel more serious than it really was. She was already there, standing behind the teacher's desk, sorting through a neat stack of papers. There was an elegance to her movements that caught my attention immediately, something effortless but deliberate. She looked up, and her eyes met mine with a mixture of curiosity and a quiet, unspoken judgment. She was older than me, at least in her 40s, but there was a vitality to her presence that felt strangely intimate, as if she could see more than I intended to reveal. "Take a seat," she said, her voice calm and measured, yet with a subtle warmth that softened the authority behind it. There was a pause, almost imperceptible, as her gaze lingered on me. The brief touch of her fingers against my hand as she handed me a folder sent a surprising warmth through me, quick and fleeting, but impossible to ignore. Her touch was light, casual, but it carried an unexpected steadiness, like she was grounding me without trying. I sank into the chair, suddenly hyper-aware of the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in the quiet room. The ticking of the clock was louder than it had any right to be, marking every second of awkwardness and anticipation. She began reviewing papers on her desk, her pen scratching softly across the pages. At one point, she murmured under her breath, almost to herself, "Detention never felt this good." I didn't know whether it was meant for me or simply a stray thought. But the words lingered in the air, teasing and mysterious, and I couldn't help stealing another glance at her. The corners of her lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly, hinting at amusement or perhaps a private joke I wasn't in on. There was an ease in the way she leaned against the desk, a quiet confidence that made me feel both out of place and oddly drawn in. Throughout the session, I couldn't stop noticing the small details, the way her hair caught the sunlight streaming through the window, the soft sway of her movements as she organized papers, the subtle perfume that seemed to wrap around the room like a gentle invitation. Every gesture, every glance, seemed charged with a calm, quiet energy I couldn't name. By the time detention ended, I realized I wasn't just curious about what I was being punished for. I was curious about her. About the way she moved, spoke, and existed in that quiet, ordered classroom. And for the first time, I wondered if detention might not be the punishment I thought it was, but something far more complicated, and strangely compelling. Detention became less of a punishment and more of a strange, magnetic ritual. I found myself counting the hours until I could be in the same room with her again, though I would never have admitted it aloud. She was always composed, moving with a quiet precision, yet there were moments, tiny, fleeting, when her guard slipped, and she became unmistakably human. I noticed the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear when she was focused, the soft furrow of her brow when reading a particularly tricky assignment. Even her sighs, light and almost inaudible, seemed to echo something deeper, an undercurrent of tiredness, of longing, of something she didn't say aloud. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a person, full of layers I could only glimpse from across the desk. Sometimes, our legs brushed beneath the table. Always brief, always accidental, or so it seemed, but the contact sent an unfamiliar warmth up my spine, a quiet pulse that left me awkwardly aware of every subtle motion. I would look down at my hands and then back up, catching her gaze just long enough to feel the electricity linger before she looked away with the faintest smile, almost shy, almost teasing. Her perfume, something soft, floral, grounded with a hint of spice, followed her as she moved through the classroom. It was faint enough not to be overpowering but distinct enough to leave an imprint in my memory. Even mundane moments, handing me a pen, adjusting a stack of papers, the way she shifted in her chair, became charged with a tension I couldn't explain. I started to notice more than just her physical presence. I noticed her attention to detail, the quiet kindness in the way she corrected mistakes, the patience she extended to students who clearly didn't deserve it. It was in these subtle demonstrations of care that I felt something stirring inside me, an admiration that went beyond attraction, something deeper, something that made me wonder about the person she was outside the classroom. And she noticed me too. I could tell by the slight pause she sometimes took when looking up from her work, the way her eyes lingered just a second too long. There was curiosity there, a hint of warmth, and maybe even a touch of caution. Neither of us acted on it, of course, not yet, but the air between us had begun to hum with quiet possibility. By the end of each session, I left Detention with my mind racing, not with regret over the mistake that had landed me there, but with questions about her. Who was she beyond the controlled exterior, the strict rules, the composed smile? I wanted to know, and strangely, I felt that she might let me, if I only paid attention to the little details, the subtle signs she left like breadcrumbs. Detention had stopped being punishment. It had become observation, learning, but not the academic kind. I was learning about her, and in the process, I was learning something new about myself, that I could feel more than admiration, that attraction could be patient, quiet, and almost reverent. It was an ordinary afternoon, but something shifted in the air. I had arrived for Detention as usual, expecting the familiar rhythm of quiet work and the occasional soft glance. But today, I noticed a small photo resting on her desk, carelessly placed, yet intimate in its presence. A younger version of her, laughing with a man whose face I could only assume belonged to someone from her past, perhaps her ex-husband. There was a subtle sadness in the curve of her smile, a trace of nostalgia that softened her otherwise composed features. I didn't mean to stare, but I felt an unexpected pull. When she caught me looking, her eyes didn't flash with anger or embarrassment, they softened, a subtle acknowledgement that she was letting me see a sliver of her life beyond the teacher persona. The vulnerability was brief, almost like a whisper, but it lingered longer than the photo itself. As we worked in silence, I found myself more attuned than ever to the small details, the way her fingers traced the edge of a paper, the quiet pause she took before answering a question, as if weighing her words not for me, but for herself. When she spoke, her voice had a warmth to it, a softness that seemed to fill the space between us. I leaned slightly closer under the guise of reading her instructions, and for the first time, I felt that my presence might be something she didn't mind. Eventually, she spoke about herself, lightly, almost accidentally, about dreams she once had, small regrets, and the simple joys she still clung to. There was no dramatization, no forced sentimentality, only honesty. Her hand brushed against mine as she passed a book across the desk, a contact brief yet electric. I could feel the subtle heat of her skin, the gentle firmness in her touch, and the way her fingers lingered just a moment longer than necessary. I realized then that this was more than attraction. It was intimacy, emotional, fragile, and unspoken. We didn't need to define it, we only needed to exist in the same space, acknowledging it silently with shared glances and fleeting touches. Even as Detention ended, the quiet lingered. I walked away with my mind full of questions. Who was she beyond the walls of the school? What experiences had shaped her into the woman who could command a classroom and yet reveal softness in a single glance? That day, I understood something fundamental: attraction without understanding is fleeting, but when paired with glimpses of vulnerability, it transforms into something deeper, almost sacred. I was drawn to her, not just to the idea of her, but to the layers she revealed so carefully, like pages in a diary, leaving me eager for the next session, and the next moment where I might see her not as a teacher, but as a woman, complex, alluring, and achingly real. It was during one of the school's weekend events that the ordinary rules of distance began to blur. Most of the students had left, leaving the building unusually quiet, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional echo of distant footsteps. She and I found ourselves alone in a classroom, tasked with organizing leftover materials for the week ahead. The silence was heavy, yet comforting, like a pause in a story waiting for the next line. I bent to pick up a stack of books, and without thinking, she moved to help me. Our hands brushed, light but deliberate, as we adjusted the pile. I felt a spark, a quiet, electric heat that traveled up my arm, making me suddenly aware of every inch of space between us. She hesitated, and then held my gaze, just long enough for me to notice the softness in her eyes, the subtle flicker of amusement that danced across her expression. "Careful," she said softly, her voice low, almost teasing. "These are heavier than they look." I nodded, trying to focus on the books, but my attention kept drifting back to her. There was a grace in the way she moved, the easy confidence that belied the vulnerability I had glimpsed before. As we shifted the stack together, our shoulders pressed closer, and I could feel the warmth of her body through the light fabric of her blouse. The scent of her perfume, something floral, subtle, grounded, mingled with the faint must of the classroom, creating a memory I would carry long after the task was done. For a brief moment, the room felt suspended in time. Our breathing synchronized, quiet and intimate, almost as if the world outside had ceased to exist. She gave a small smile, the kind that reached her eyes and softened her usually composed expression. My own pulse quickened, an unspoken awareness between us that something had shifted. Yet, even in that closeness, there was restraint. Neither of us acted on the magnetic tension, though both of us felt it keenly. I worried about the boundaries, the age difference, the judgment of others. She hesitated too, conscious of propriety, of the unspoken rules she had always followed. When the books were finally stacked and organized, she stepped back, leaving a small space between us, and for a moment, we simply held each other's gaze. No words were necessary, the fleeting touches, the shared warmth, and the electric brush of hands had said more than any conversation could. Walking away that day, I realized that detention had evolved into something more profound. It wasn't punishment, observation, or mere attraction, it was a quiet awakening, an acknowledgement that connection could exist in subtle glances, accidental touches, and the fragile moments when two people dared to stand closer than they ever had before. It was late, much later than usual, when I found myself still in the classroom. Most of the building was dark, the halls quiet except for the distant hum of security lights. She was there too, tidying up papers and leftover supplies from the day, her movement slower, almost languid, as if the emptiness of the room had softened her usual precision. The golden light from the desk lamp spilled across her face, highlighting the soft contours of her features and the faint tiredness beneath her eyes. We worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustle of papers and the occasional shuffle of chairs. I was aware of her proximity in a way that had nothing to do with rules or restraint, every subtle motion felt magnified. When she leaned over to reach a pile of worksheets, our arms brushed again, slightly longer this time, and I caught the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her sleeve. The touch was accidental, yet deliberate in its impact, a spark that left a soft, lingering pulse in my chest. Then, almost without warning, she spoke. Her voice was lower than usual, softer, almost confiding. "You make this easier than it should be." The words were casual, but the tone carried an intimacy I hadn't heard before. She looked at me then, her gaze steady, searching, and I realized she was sharing something unspoken, an acknowledgement of the unusual bond growing between us. I hesitated, unsure how to respond, my own pulse quickening. The quiet weight of the room pressed around us, a cocoon shielding the moment from the outside world. She didn't step back, she simply let her words hang in the air, as if daring me to bridge the invisible distance that still lingered. "Sometimes I feel alive in ways I didn't expect," she admitted, almost a whisper, as she stacked a final set of papers. Her fingers brushed mine again briefly, this time lingering just enough to let me feel the steady warmth beneath her skin. The sensation was grounding, intimate, and impossibly inviting. We didn't rush to define what was happening between us. There was hesitation in our proximity, a quiet respect for boundaries, but the tension was undeniable. I could see the vulnerability flicker in her eyes, the rare softness that appeared when she let herself be seen, even briefly. By the time we left the classroom, the dim light of the hallway cast long shadows, but none of them could obscure the awareness between us. The confession, small and tentative as it was, had shifted everything. We were no longer just teacher and student, observer and observed. We were two people standing close, feeling something dangerous and thrilling, yet choosing, for the moment, to honor the fragile intimacy that had begun to grow. In the silence that followed, I realized this was no longer about detention, or rules, or mistakes. It was about something far more compelling, the quiet, electric acknowledgement that we were both awake to each other, and that neither of us wanted to look away. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when we found ourselves alone again, this time in the small, sunlit corner of the library. The usual bustle of students was absent, leaving only the soft rustle of pages and the faint scent of polished wood and old books. We were sitting close, side by side at a table scattered with papers, books, and pens, the mundane setting suddenly charged with unspoken significance. For a while, we worked in silence. I tried to focus on the assignment in front of me, but my attention kept drifting to her, how her fingers moved across the paper, the subtle arch of her back as she leaned over a book, the soft warmth of her shoulder brushing mine when she shifted. Every small movement seemed amplified, intimate, and magnetic. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, hesitant, yet steady. "I've been thinking about us, about this." The words hung in the air, fragile and tremulous, like the first note of a song yet to be completed. She didn't move closer, didn't retreat, she simply let me exist in the space between her words and her gaze, giving me the freedom to respond without pressure. I swallowed, my own voice almost catching in my throat. "I feel it too," I admitted, and even saying it aloud made the tension tangible, like static electricity in the air. There was a moment of silence after that, but it wasn't empty. It was charged with understanding, recognition, and the thrill of mutual vulnerability. We spoke then, honestly, carefully, about fear, desire, and the unspoken rules that society might impose. There was hesitation, of course. I worried about our age difference, the implications if anyone knew, and the complexity of her past. She worried too, though not about me. She worried about the propriety of giving herself to someone younger, about the caution required to protect both our hearts. Even so, there was a moment when words weren't necessary. Her hand brushed mine while passing a pen, a gesture light but deliberate, sending a warmth through my chest that made my pulse quicken. I didn't pull away, and neither did she. Instead, we let the silence speak, the touch speak, the shared glance speak of something far more profound than conversation could ever capture. In that quiet space, I realized we had reached the heart of our connection. It wasn't passion or desire alone, it was trust, respect, and the intimacy of someone finally letting you see who they truly are. And in that recognition, the slow-burn tension that had been simmering for weeks reached a gentle, emotional peak, a moment of clarity, where attraction, admiration, and vulnerability coalesced into a bond neither of us could deny. By the time we left the library, it was with the knowledge that what we had was real. Not fleeting, not forbidden, but meaningful. And in that quiet triumph, I understood that the most profound connections are often born in subtle touches, whispered truths, and the courage to simply be present with someone who sees you completely. A week later, we met outside the walls of the school, in a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street. The sun was warm on my shoulders, and a soft breeze carried the faint scent of blooming flowers from a nearby park. It was a neutral space, no desks, no rules, no expectations, just the two of us, and the fragile, tender connection we had cultivated over weeks of stolen moments and quiet glances. She was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window with a book in her hands. Even in casual clothes, there was an elegance to her posture, a graceful confidence tempered by the softness in her eyes. As I approached, she looked up and smiled, warm, genuine, and just slightly shy. The sight made my chest tighten, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond we had nurtured in the shadows of the classroom. We sat across from each other, letting conversation flow naturally. There was laughter, soft, unguarded, and easy, and the kind of pauses that weren't awkward but comfortable, filled with shared understanding. When she reached across the table to adjust a napkin near my cup, our fingers brushed. The contact was light, deliberate in its subtle intimacy, sending a warmth through my chest that was both grounding and exhilarating. At one point, our hands rested near each other, close enough to touch, and I found the courage to let mine hover briefly over hers. She didn't pull away, instead, she let her hand remain near mine, the gentle proximity a silent promise of trust and affection. It was a small gesture, but it carried all the weight of everything we hadn't said, the mutual respect, the understanding of boundaries, the acknowledgement of a connection that had grown slowly, deliberately, and beautifully. The afternoon stretched on, a slow, golden hour of sunlight, conversation, and quiet laughter. I noticed the subtle details, the way her eyes caught the light, the gentle curve of her smile, the soft rhythm of her breathing as she leaned forward to share a story. Every movement, every glance, every touch felt imbued with meaning, a confirmation of what we had both felt from the beginning. When it was time to leave, we stood together outside the cafe. The warmth of the sun on our faces mirrored the warmth between us. She reached out, letting her fingers brush mine, a lingering touch that spoke of unspoken promises and a future yet to be written. We parted with a soft smile, a shared understanding that this was just the beginning, not a fleeting attraction, but the start of something meaningful, tender, and real. Walking away, I realized that detention, the awkward glances, the quiet touches, and the stolen moments had led to this, an age-gap connection that felt natural, respectful, and deeply human. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a quiet certainty. Sometimes, the most profound relationships grow not from grand gestures, but from patience, understanding, and the courage to let two hearts slowly find each other. If you enjoyed this slow burn, age gap romance, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more heartfelt stories, and comment below, which moment in their journey touched you the most. Don't forget to share this story with someone who loves a little forbidden attraction mixed with tender, emotional connection.